Nathan Barnes, a retired firefighter, had always been a man of action, someone who thrived on adrenaline and purpose. But at 65, those days felt like distant memories. His home, a modest wooden cabin nestled on the outskirts of a small Wyoming town near the sprawling forests of Yellowstone, had grown eerily quiet over the years. His wife, the love of his life, had passed away a decade earlier, and his two children now lived scattered across the country, busy with their own families. Though Nathan kept himself occupied fixing old tools, writing letters to his grandkids, and maintaining his small vegetable garden, the silence of his days often pressed heavily against him. It was during one of those frigid, lonely winter nights that Nathan's world changed forever. Snow blanketed the winding roads leading to his cabin, the wind howling like a distant, forlorn cry. Nathan had made a quick trip into town to pick up supplies before the forecasted storm worsened. The drive home was slow and cautious, his truck's headlights slicing through the swirling snow that danced erratically in the gusty wind. As he approached a bend in the road, something caught his eye. A dark, unmoving shape against the stark white of the roadside snow. At first, he thought it was just a pile of debris, perhaps a fallen branch or a discarded tarp. But as he slowed down and peered closer, his firefighter instincts kicked in. It wasn't debris, it was alive. Pulling his truck to the shoulder, Nathan left the warmth of the cab and stepped into the biting cold. The air stung his face, and his boots crunched through the snow as he made his way toward the shape. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a tiny figure huddled against the elements. It was a small animal, its grayish coat dusted with snow and trembling violently from the cold. Nathan crouched down, his heart tightening at the sight. The animal looked up weakly, its amber eyes locking onto his with a haunting vulnerability that sent a chill through him deeper than the Wyoming winter ever could. It was small, barely the size of a house cat, with sharp features and a fragile skeletal frame. Its fur was matted, its body visibly exhausted from what must have been days, if not weeks, of struggling to survive the unforgiving wilderness. "Hey there, little one," Nathan murmured softly, his voice breaking the eerie silence of the snowy night. He instinctively shrugged off his thick coat and wrapped it gently around the trembling creature, lifting it into his arms. Its body was limp and cold against his chest, but the faint rise and fall of its ribcage told him it was still alive. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he whispered, holding the bundle close as he hurried back to the truck. He opened the passenger door, carefully placing the animal on the seat before cranking up the heat. For a moment he sat there, watching the creature as it curled slightly into itself, seeking the warmth radiating from the vents. Nathan had always been a practical man, someone who believed in clear plans and logical actions, but as he looked at the small animal on his passenger seat, something deeper stirred within him. A protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what kind of animal it was. Its sharp ears and lean frame reminded him of a wild coyote, but its fragile, youthful size made it look more like a puppy. Either way, it didn't matter in that moment. It needed him, and he wasn't about to let it die alone in the snow. The drive back to his cabin was filled with quiet reassurances. "We'll get you warm," Nathan said, glancing over at the shivering bundle. "I'll figure out what you are tomorrow. For now, let's just focus on getting you through the night." The storm was intensifying by the time Nathan reached his cabin. Snow piled high around the wooden steps leading to his front door. He scooped up the animal and carried it inside, the sudden warmth of the fireplace contrasting sharply with the biting cold outside. Gently, he placed the small creature on a thick folded blanket near the hearth. With trembling hands, Nathan fetched another blanket from the closet, layering it over the little animal as it remained motionless, save for the faint twitch of its nose. He grabbed a small bowl of lukewarm water from the kitchen and set it down nearby, coaxing the creature with soft whispers. It stirred, its amber eyes blinking slowly as it weakly licked at the water. "There you go," Nathan said softly, feeling a small glimmer of hope. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" As the night wore on, Nathan couldn't tear his eyes away from his new companion. He noticed its unusual features, the pointed snout, the bushy tail, and the sharpness of its gaze even in its weakened state. Something about it seemed different, almost otherworldly, but Nathan pushed those thoughts aside. Right now, it was just a helpless creature in need of care, and that was all that mattered. He spent the next few hours tending to it as best he could, drying its damp fur with a soft towel and ensuring it stayed warm. The animal seemed to relax slightly, its trembling less pronounced as it drifted into a restless sleep. Nathan sat nearby, watching the snowstorm rage through the window, while the creature's steady breathing provided a calming rhythm in the quiet cabin. As midnight approached, Nathan felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at him, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the little animal's side. He dragged a chair closer to the fireplace, his eyes growing heavy as he watched the rise and fall of its tiny chest. In the glow of the firelight, the creature almost looked serene, its wild edges softened by the warmth and safety of Nathan's home. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The soft light of dawn filtered through the frosted windows of Nathan Barnes's cabin, casting golden streaks across the wooden floors. Outside, the remnants of the previous night's snowstorm blanketed the Wyoming landscape in pristine white, muffling the world in quiet stillness. Inside, Nathan stirred awake, his body stiff from spending the night in his armchair. His first thought wasn't about the discomfort in his back or the cold draft seeping under the door. It was about the small, fragile creature curled near the fire. He blinked a few times, focusing on the animal. The night before, it had been a trembling, weak shadow of itself, barely clinging to life. But now, in the soft morning light, there was something quietly resilient about it. Its fur, which had dried overnight, was thick and flecked with shades of gray and white. Its pointed ears twitched faintly, and its chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. It wasn't just surviving, it was resting, almost at peace. Nathan couldn't help but smile. "Good morning, Shadow," he murmured, the name coming to him naturally. There was something about the way the little creature moved, silent, cautious, like it belonged to the darker edges of the world. The name fit, and Nathan found comfort in naming it, as if giving the animal an identity made it more real, more his. Shadow didn't stir as Nathan rose from the chair and padded to the kitchen. He rummaged through his cabinets, setting out a small plate of cooked chicken and a bowl of lukewarm water. He wasn't entirely sure what the creature ate, but this seemed like a good place to start. Shadow eventually lifted its head, amber eyes flickering open. They locked onto Nathan with a sharpness that startled him. For a moment, he felt as though he was the one being studied, as if Shadow was deciding whether or not to trust him. Then, with deliberate slowness, it rose to its feet and approached the plate. Nathan sat quietly, watching as Shadow sniffed the food cautiously before taking a tentative bite. It chewed methodically, not with the frantic hunger Nathan might have expected from an animal that had clearly been starving. Shadow wasn't desperate. It was deliberate, almost dignified. Nathan chuckled under his breath. "You're not like any dog I've ever seen," he said softly, more to himself than to the animal. Over the next few days, Nathan began to notice other peculiarities about Shadow. It moved through the cabin with an eerie silence, its steps calculated and deliberate. Unlike the dogs Nathan had grown up with, Shadow didn't bound or stumble. Instead, it prowled, its lean body gliding smoothly across the wooden floors. It didn't bark either. The only sounds it made were soft, high-pitched chirps or the occasional low whine, both of which seemed oddly out of place for a dog. Despite its oddities, Shadow had a magnetic presence that Nathan couldn't ignore. It followed him everywhere, at a distance at first, but gradually closer as the days passed. Whether Nathan was stacking firewood outside or repairing an old lamp at his workbench, Shadow would be nearby, watching. Its amber eyes never missed a movement, and Nathan often found himself talking to it as if it were a longtime companion. "I used to have a dog named Rusty," he said one afternoon while tightening a bolt on a loose chair leg. "Big, goofy thing, always knocking stuff over with his tail. You, though, you're different. You've got some mystery in you." Shadow chirped softly from its perch under the dining table, tilting its head in that peculiar way that made Nathan laugh. It was as if the creature understood him, as if it were more than just a pet. But the more time Nathan spent with Shadow, the more questions began to gnaw at him. What exactly had he brought into his home? Shadow's features, the sharp snout, the bushy tail, the lean, muscular frame, seemed too wild, too untamed to belong to any domestic breed Nathan had ever seen. And then there were the behaviors. The way Shadow seemed to prefer hiding in dark corners. The way it instinctively crouched low when it heard unfamiliar sounds. The way it stored bits of food in secret spots around the cabin. It wasn't just peculiar. It was unexplainable. One evening, as Nathan settled into his armchair with a book, he caught sight of Shadow staring out the window. The creature was perfectly still, its ears pricked forward, its body tense. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote's mournful call echoed through the night. Shadow responded with a sound that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. A low, melodic howl, soft but haunting. It wasn't the sound of a dog. It was something older, something wild. Nathan set his book down, his heart thudding in his chest. He approached Shadow cautiously, crouching beside it near the window. "What are you, huh?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Shadow turned to look at him, its amber eyes reflecting the faint glow of the firelight. For a moment, Nathan felt like he was staring into something ancient, something untamed. The days that followed only deepened the mystery. Shadow grew stronger and more confident, exploring every inch of the cabin with its quiet, purposeful movements. It seemed to favor high places, often climbing onto the back of the couch or perching on the windowsill to watch the world outside. Nathan found himself marveling at its agility, its grace. It didn't move like a dog, it moved like a predator. Still, there were moments of softness that endeared Shadow to Nathan even more. At night, when the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Shadow would curl up near Nathan's feet, its body warm and relaxed. Nathan often reached down to stroke its fur, marveling at the way it leaned into his touch, its eyes half closed in contentment. "You're not just some stray," Nathan said one night, his voice heavy with emotion. "You're special. I don't know what brought you to me, but I'm glad you're here." The bond between them deepened with each passing day, but Nathan couldn't ignore the questions lingering in the back of his mind. Shadow's wild nature was undeniable, and Nathan began to worry about what that meant, for both of them. What if Shadow wasn't meant to stay? What if its place was out there, in the wilderness, where it could roam free? The thought was a painful one, but Nathan pushed it aside. For now, Shadow was here, and that was enough. But Shadow's instincts couldn't be ignored forever. One crisp morning, as Nathan chopped wood in the yard, Shadow froze mid-step, its ears swiveling toward the tree line. Nathan followed its gaze and saw nothing, but Shadow remained tense, its body low to the ground. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, it darted toward the forest edge, stopping just short of the trees. It sniffed the air, its tail swishing behind it, and let out another soft howl. Nathan called to it, his voice firm but gentle. "Shadow, come back." For a moment, Shadow hesitated, its gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Then, slowly, it turned and trotted back to Nathan, its movements reluctant but obedient. Nathan knelt beside it, running a hand through its thick fur. "What are you looking for out there?" he asked softly. Shadow didn't answer, of course, but its eyes seemed to hold a quiet longing that Nathan couldn't ignore. That night, as Shadow lay curled at his feet, Nathan stared into the fire, his mind heavy with thoughts. Shadow wasn't just an animal to him anymore, it was a companion, a kindred spirit. But the question remained. Could Nathan hold on to something that was meant to be wild? And if he couldn't, how long could this fragile harmony between them last? As the firelight danced across the cabin walls, Nathan made a silent promise to himself. Whatever Shadow's path turned out to be, he would honor it. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. Winter's grasp on the Wyoming wilderness tightened as February rolled in, bringing with it bitter winds and an unrelenting silence. Nathan Barnes's cabin, once a sanctuary of peace, now felt like a pressure cooker of worry and urgency. Shadow, oblivious to the storm brewing beyond the cabin walls, had grown more confident and playful over the weeks. It darted through the house with the silent grace of a predator, leaping onto windowsills to observe the snowy landscape and curling at Nathan's feet each evening as the fire crackled in the hearth. But Nathan's heart grew heavier with each passing day. Since learning the truth about Shadow, that it was no ordinary dog but a gray wolf, he hadn't been able to shake the fear of losing it. Shadow had become more than a companion. It was family. Yet the law didn't see things that way. Wolves, especially in Wyoming, were protected under strict wildlife laws. Keeping one as a pet was not only illegal but could also result in Shadow being taken away and possibly sent to a sanctuary, or worse. Nathan knew he had to act fast, but he also knew he wasn't the only one noticing Shadow. The first sign came one cold morning when Nathan stepped outside to chop firewood. Shadow followed him as usual, its bushy tail swishing happily as it explored the yard. Nathan smiled at the sight, his worries momentarily fading as he watched Shadow investigate a pile of snow near the woodshed. But his smile disappeared when he spotted Walter Miller, his neighbor from half a mile down the road, standing at the edge of his property. Walter was a man of habit, always stopping by to chat whenever he passed Nathan's cabin on his morning walks. But today, his eyes were locked on Shadow, his expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "That's some dog you've got there," Walter called out, his voice cutting through the crisp air. Nathan forced a laugh, trying to keep his tone casual. "Yeah, found him during that big storm last month. He's been keeping me company." Walter stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "He doesn't look like any dog I've ever seen. Looks more like a wolf." Nathan's chest tightened. "He's got some unusual features, sure," he said, trying to deflect. "Probably some kind of mix. Hard to tell with rescues, you know." Walter didn't reply right away. He studied Shadow for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Well, you take care of him. Wolves can be trouble around here. Folks don't take kindly to them." Nathan watched as Walter walked away, his boots crunching in the snow. A knot of unease settled in his stomach. Shadow had returned to his side, oblivious to the tension, its bright amber eyes focused on the firewood in Nathan's hands. The second warning sign came a week later. Nathan had driven into town to stock up on supplies and pick up a few extra toys and treats for Shadow. As he loaded his truck with bags of groceries, he overheard a conversation between two locals standing by the hardware store. "Did you hear about that guy up near the woods?" one of them said. "Miller says he's keeping a wolf as a pet." The other man scoffed. "That's illegal as hell. Game wardens won't let that slide." Nathan's grip on the shopping bag tightened, his pulse quickening. He ducked into the driver's seat and started the engine, driving home with a growing sense of dread. By the time he reached the cabin, his hands were trembling. Shadow greeted him at the door with its usual excitement, unaware of the storm Nathan now carried inside. 2 days later, Nathan's worst fear became reality. It was early afternoon when he heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Peeking through the window, he saw a dark green truck with the logo of the Heartwarming Wildlife Protection Division emblazoned on the side. A man in a thick jacket and boots stepped out, his clipboard in hand. Nathan's heart sank. "Mr. Barnes," the man called as he approached the door. "Officer Mark Stevenson. I'd like to have a word with you." Nathan stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Shadow watched from the window, its nose pressed to the glass. "What's this about?" Nathan asked, though he already knew the answer. "We've received reports that you're harboring a wolf on your property," Officer Stevenson said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Is that true?" Nathan's mind raced. He could lie, claim Shadow was just a strange-looking dog, but he knew it wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. Instead, he took a deep breath and nodded. "I found him as a pup during the storm. He was barely alive. I didn't know what he was at first, but by the time I realized it was too late. He'd already bonded with me." Officer Stevenson studied Nathan for a moment before glancing at the window, where Shadow's amber eyes gleamed. "You understand that keeping a wolf is illegal in this state," he said. "Wolves are protected under federal and state law. This isn't something we can overlook." Nathan felt a surge of desperation. "He's not wild," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "He's been with me for weeks. He wouldn't survive out there. Please, you can't take him." Stevenson's expression softened, but his tone remained firm. "Mr. Barnes, I'm not here to take him today, but you need to understand the gravity of the situation. If you want to keep him, you'll need to apply for a special permit. That process isn't easy and there are no guarantees." Nathan nodded, relief washing over him, though it was tinged with lingering fear. "What do I need to do?" "You'll need to prove that the animal is fully dependent on you and incapable of surviving in the wild," Stevenson explained. "You'll also need to provide a safe and secure enclosure that meets wildlife standards. I'll give you 2 weeks to start the application process. After that, we'll conduct a follow-up visit. If you haven't made progress, we'll have no choice but to remove the animal." Nathan's shoulders sagged as Stevenson handed him a business card and a yellow notice. "I suggest you work quickly," the officer added. "Time isn't on your side." As the truck pulled away, Nathan stood in the driveway, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Shadow whined softly from the window, its head tilted in confusion. Nathan turned back to the cabin, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to lose Shadow, not without a fight. Over the next few days, Nathan threw himself into action. He contacted Dr. Grace Carter, who agreed to help with the permit application by providing a detailed behavioral assessment of Shadow. He spent hours documenting Shadow's habits, taking photos and videos to show how deeply the animal had bonded with him. He wrote letters to wildlife experts, seeking advice on how to meet the enclosure requirements, and even reached out to his old firehouse colleagues for support. Each evening, as Shadow curled up beside him, Nathan felt the weight of the ticking clock. The thought of losing Shadow was unbearable, but he knew the odds were stacked against him. The law didn't care about the bond they shared, it only cared about rules and regulations. But Nathan wasn't one to give up easily. Shadow had chosen him, and he would do everything in his power to make sure it could stay. As the 2-week deadline approached, Nathan's cabin buzzed with activity. The yard had been transformed into the beginnings of a secure enclosure, with heavy-duty fencing and reinforced gates. Inside, folders of documentation and letters of support filled the dining table. Shadow watched Nathan's every move, its eyes filled with a quiet trust that both comforted and haunted him. On the final night before the follow-up visit, Nathan sat by the fire with Shadow resting at his feet. He ran a hand through its thick fur, his heart heavy with the knowledge that tomorrow could change everything. "No matter what happens," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm not giving up on you." Shadow let out a soft, contented chirp, pressing its head against Nathan's leg. The firelight flickered, casting warm shadows across the room, and for a moment, the fear and uncertainty faded, replaced by the unshakable bond between man and wolf. Whatever came next, Nathan knew he would face it head-on, for Shadow, for their shared journey, and for the home they had built together. The wind howled through the Wyoming pines, rattling the windows of Nathan Barnes's cabin as another cold night descended upon the quiet landscape. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light across the walls. Nathan sat at his desk, poring over the final details of his permit application. The room was silent except for the occasional scratch of pen on paper and the soft rustling of Shadow's movements near the window. Nathan glanced up from his work, his eyes resting on Shadow's lean figure. The wolf stood with its front paws balanced on the windowsill, staring into the dark expanse of the woods. Its ears were pricked, its tail still, and its sharp amber eyes glinted with something Nathan couldn't quite name. Longing? Curiosity? Instinct? Whatever it was, it unnerved him. It was a look he had seen more frequently in recent days, and each time it seemed to pull Shadow further from the cozy warmth of the cabin and closer to the wild world outside. "Something out there, boy?" Nathan asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Shadow didn't respond. Its focus remained fixed on the darkness beyond the trees, as if waiting for something, or someone. Nathan set his pen down, rubbing his tired eyes. He had been working tirelessly to meet the requirements for Shadow's permit, documenting its behavior, reinforcing the outdoor enclosure, and compiling letters of support from Dr. Grace Carter and others. Yet, even as he threw himself into the process, the nagging question remained. Was he doing the right thing? Was it fair to keep Shadow here, bound by human rules and fences, when its very essence seemed to belong to the wilderness? That question lingered heavily in his mind as the days turned into nights and the nights into mornings. Shadow had always been an enigma, balancing precariously between the wild and the domestic. It followed Nathan around the house, chirping softly for attention and curling at his feet by the fire. Yet it also moved with the silent grace of a predator, its sharp instincts betraying a connection to a world Nathan could never truly understand. The tipping point came on a clear, frigid night. The sky was a canvas of stars, their light illuminating the snow-covered ground with an ethereal glow. Nathan had just settled into his armchair when a strange sound pierced the silence, a low, mournful howl, distant but unmistakable. Shadow's head snapped up, its ears swiveling toward the sound. It let out a soft whine, pacing toward the door with a restless energy Nathan hadn't seen before. "What is it, boy?" Nathan asked, rising from his chair. Shadow turned to him briefly, its eyes wide and pleading, before returning its focus to the door. The howl came again, louder this time, and Shadow's body tensed, its instincts pulling it toward the source. Nathan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had always known this moment might come, the moment when the call of the wild would prove too strong for Shadow to resist. But now that it was here, he wasn't ready. Shadow wasn't just an animal to him, it was family. Letting it go felt unthinkable, yet keeping it here felt selfish. With a heavy sigh, Nathan walked to the door and opened it. The cold air rushed in, stinging his skin and carrying with it the scent of pine and snow. Shadow hesitated for a moment, its gaze darting between Nathan and the dark forest beyond. Nathan crouched down, resting a hand on Shadow's head. "If you want to go, I won't stop you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But if you stay, you'll always have a home here." Shadow stared at him, its amber eyes searching his face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. the silence between them broken only by the faint rustle of the trees. Then, with deliberate slowness, Shadow turned and stepped out into the night. Nathan stood frozen in the doorway, watching as Shadow moved toward the tree line. Its sleek body was almost invisible against the shadows of the forest, but its every step was purposeful, its posture tense with anticipation. When it reached the edge of the woods, it stopped and tilted its head back, letting out a soft, melodic howl. A moment later, the howl was answered, closer now and joined by others. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was witnessing. A pack. Shadow's kind. The wolves emerged from the darkness one by one, their forms ghostly and graceful under the starlight. They approached cautiously, their eyes glowing like embers as they assessed Shadow. For a few heart-stopping moments, Nathan feared the worst. Would they accept Shadow? Or would they see it as an intruder, a stranger unfit for their world? Shadow stood tall, its body language confident but not aggressive. It sniffed the air, moving closer to the pack leader, a large, silver-furred wolf with piercing eyes. The two locked gazes, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, the silver wolf turned and padded deeper into the woods, the rest of the pack following. Shadow hesitated, its head turning back toward Nathan. Their eyes met across the distance, and Nathan's heart ached with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. "Go on," Nathan whispered, though the words felt like a betrayal. "This is your world." But to his surprise, Shadow didn't follow the pack. Instead, it took a few tentative steps back toward the cabin. The wolves paused, their howls echoing softly in the distance, but Shadow remained still, caught between two worlds. Finally, it turned fully and trotted back to Nathan, its tail low but wagging slightly, as if to say, "I'm not ready to leave." Nathan let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him like a wave. He knelt down as Shadow reached him, wrapping his arms around the wolf in a rare embrace. "You scared me there, boy," he murmured, his voice cracking. "But I guess we both know where you belong." Shadow pressed its head against Nathan's chest, letting out a soft chirp that felt like a promise. The walk back to the cabin was quiet, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their feet. Nathan closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold and the wild calls of the pack. Shadow settled near the fire, curling into a tight ball as if nothing had happened. But Nathan knew better. Something had shifted that night. Not just in Shadow, but in himself. Shadow had made its choice, and for now, it had chosen him. But Nathan also knew that the wild call would never truly fade. Shadow's instincts, its heritage, were as much a part of it as the bond they shared. He couldn't ignore that, and he wouldn't try. Instead, he would cherish the time they had, however long it lasted. As the fire crackled and the stars faded into the dawn, Nathan sat beside Shadow, his hand resting gently on its thick fur. The question of where Shadow truly belonged no longer haunted him. It wasn't about fences or laws or even the forest. Shadow belonged to the moment, to the choices it made, to the life it was building with Nathan. And for now, that was enough. The first warmth of spring began to creep into the Wyoming wilderness, melting the snowbanks that had surrounded Nathan Barnes's cabin for months. The soft trickle of water from melting ice mixed with the gentle rustle of new leaves in the wind, signaling the end of the long, harsh winter. For Nathan, the change in seasons brought more than the promise of warmer days. It brought the promise of a new chapter, one that he and Shadow had fought so hard to secure. It had been a month since Nathan received the call from the Wyoming Wildlife Protection Division. The voice on the other end had been calm but firm, informing him that the special permit had been approved under strict conditions. Shadow could stay, but Nathan had to meet specific requirements to ensure the wolf's safety and well-being. The news had been both a relief and a call to action. Nathan wasted no time diving into the work needed to keep Shadow legally and ethically. The cabin's modest yard, once a simple open space bordered by the edge of the forest, had been transformed into something far more elaborate. Nathan had spent weeks constructing an enclosure that met the Wildlife Division's rigorous standards. The fence, towering 10 feet high with reinforced steel and dig-proof foundations, surrounded a sprawling area filled with natural features, logs for climbing, shaded dens for resting, and even a small stream Nathan had carefully redirected to flow through the space. Watching Shadow explore the enclosure for the first time had been an emotional moment for Nathan. The wolf moved through the space with a mix of curiosity and caution, sniffing at the fresh earth and testing the strength of the logs beneath its paws. At one point, Shadow had paused near the edge of the enclosure, its nose pointed toward the forest beyond. Nathan had held his breath, half expecting Shadow to try to scale the fence, but the wolf had simply turned back toward him, its amber eyes meeting his with an expression that Nathan could only describe as contentment. "This is yours now?" Nathan had said quietly, leaning against the fence as he watched Shadow settle onto a patch of sunlight near the stream. "A little slice of wild right here at home." For Nathan, the enclosure wasn't just about meeting legal requirements. It was about honoring who Shadow was. The wolf's dual nature, caught between the wild and the domestic, had been a constant reminder of the delicate balance they had to maintain. The enclosure gave Shadow the freedom to express its instincts while still keeping it safe. It wasn't the same as the boundless freedom of the forest, but it was a compromise that allowed them to stay together. The firehouse, where Nathan still volunteered occasionally, had become a second home for Shadow. Though Nathan kept the wolf's public outings to a minimum to avoid drawing too much attention, the crew had grown to accept Shadow as an unofficial mascot. Sparky, the station's Dalmatian, had initially been wary of the new arrival, but the two animals had eventually reached an understanding. Shadow, ever observant, seemed to know how to avoid confrontation, navigating the firehouse with the same quiet grace it displayed at home. Eddie, Nathan's closest friend at the station, had taken to calling Shadow the quiet firefighter. "He's got the instincts, Nate," Eddie had joked one afternoon, watching as Shadow sniffed at the turnout gear in the corner. "Bet he'd track down a lost hiker faster than any of us." Eddie's words had stuck with Nathan. The idea of training Shadow for search and rescue work seemed almost absurd at first. Wolves weren't exactly known for their cooperative nature, but the more Nathan thought about it, the more it made sense. Shadow's keen senses, its ability to navigate difficult terrain, and its bond with Nathan made it uniquely suited for the task. With guidance from Dr. Grace Carter, who had continued to support them through the permit process, Nathan began experimenting with simple training exercises. At first, it was small things, teaching Shadow to follow commands like stay and find. The wolf's intelligence became apparent quickly. It picked up on the exercises faster than Nathan had expected, its sharp mind eager to solve the puzzles Nathan presented. Over time, they progressed to more complex tasks, practicing in the forested areas near the cabin. Shadow's natural instincts shone through, but it was the trust between them that made the training truly effective. Nathan knew that Shadow wasn't following commands out of submission. It was following because it chose to. Their first real test came on a cold, foggy morning in late spring. A call came through the firehouse radio about a missing hiker, a young woman who had wandered off a trail near the northern edge of the forest. The search had already been underway for hours, with no success. Nathan had hesitated, unsure if Shadow was ready for something so serious. But Eddie had clapped him on the shoulder, his grin both encouraging and mischievous. "If anyone can find her, it's Shadow. Give him a chance." The search was grueling. The forest was dense, the ground uneven, and the fog made visibility almost non-existent. But Shadow moved with a confidence that Nathan couldn't help but admire. The wolf's nose twitched constantly, its ears swiveling at every sound. Nathan followed closely, trusting Shadow's instincts even when the trail seemed to lead nowhere. After nearly an hour of searching, Shadow stopped suddenly, its body low to the ground. It sniffed the air, then let out a soft bark, a sound Nathan had rarely heard from it. Shadow darted forward, leading Nathan to a small clearing where the young woman lay huddled against a fallen log. She was cold and frightened, but otherwise unharmed. The relief Nathan felt was overwhelming, and as the rescue team arrived to assist her, he knelt beside Shadow, running a hand through its thick fur. "You did good, boy," he said, his voice filled with pride. Shadow licked his hand, its amber eyes bright with understanding. That moment marked a turning point for both Nathan and Shadow. It wasn't just about proving what Shadow could do. It was about finding a new purpose together. The wolf's role in the rescue effort solidified its place not just in Nathan's life, but in the community as well. Shadow wasn't just a pet or even just a wolf. It was a bridge between worlds, a testament to the bond that had grown between man and beast. As summer rolled in, the days grew longer, and the forest around the cabin burst into life. Nathan often found himself sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching Shadow explore the enclosure or nap in the dappled sunlight. The wolf's movements were as graceful as ever, but there was a new ease to them now, a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. Nathan thought often about the journey they had taken together, the stormy night when he had first found Shadow, the months of uncertainty and fear, and the moment when Shadow had chosen to stay. It hadn't been an easy path, but it had been worth it. Shadow had taught him so much, not just about wolves, but about himself. In caring for Shadow, Nathan had rediscovered a sense of purpose, a reason to look forward to each day. As the sun dipped below the horizon one warm evening, casting the forest in hues of orange and gold, Nathan leaned back in his chair, a contented smile on his face. Shadow lay at his feet, its body relaxed, but its eyes still alert, ever watchful. Nathan reached down to scratch behind its ears, earning a soft chirp in response. "You're where you belong," Nathan said quietly, his voice filled with both gratitude and love. "And so am I." In that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the wilderness and the steady presence of his unlikely companion, Nathan felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Shadow had come into his life as a mystery, a challenge, and a gift. Together they had built something extraordinary, a home that embraced both the wild and the human, the untamed and the familiar. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Nathan knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The story of Nathan and Shadow carries a profound and deeply human message about connection, resilience, and the delicate balance between freedom and belonging. At its core, it is a tale of two souls, one man searching for purpose after years of loss, and one wolf caught between its wild instincts and the love it has found in an unexpected home. Together they build a bond that transcends the boundaries of species, showing that trust, compassion, and understanding can bridge even the widest gaps. For Nathan, Shadow represents more than just a companion. The wolf becomes a symbol of healing and renewal. In caring for Shadow, Nathan finds a new sense of purpose, rediscovering his capacity for love and devotion after years of solitude. For Shadow, Nathan's home provides the safety and stability it needs to reconcile its wild nature with the life it has chosen to share with him. The wolf teaches Nathan that love isn't about possession, but about honoring the essence of the other, allowing them to be who they truly are. The story also reflects on the tension between human structures, laws, rules, and enclosures, and the raw, unbridled freedom of the natural world. It challenges us to consider what it means to coexist with nature, to respect its wildness, while finding ways to connect with it meaningfully. Nathan's decision to fight for Shadow, not out of selfishness, but because he understands their bond, reminds us that the most meaningful relationships are those built on mutual respect and choice. Ultimately, the story reminds us of the beauty in unexpected connections. Nathan and Shadow's journey is a testament to the transformative power of love and the healing that comes when we open our hearts to others, to the wild, and to the unknown. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.